It is November 19th, 1995. But for Beatles fans, it might as well have been Christmas. After years upon years of simmering rumors and speculation, the day has finally come. The release of what was to become the most definitive, most comprehensive Beatles documentary ever produced. The Beatles Anthology. The Beatles story, told not by others, but by the Beatles themselves. With this came hours upon hours of interviews, previously unseen footage, as well as hundreds of Beatles recordings that had only ever been passed around through the hands of bootleggers. Oh, and a book as well. But the shadow cast over all of this was, of course, John Lennon. His murder in 1980 affected untold millions. It was a tragic, senseless death. In the scope of his life and his impact on the culture as a whole, the Beatles were just a piece of John. One that, admittedly, he resented for a long time.
One has to completely humiliate oneself to be what the Beatles were.
As it was only in the last few years of his life that his perspective began to soften. But in the life of the Beatles, John was far more than just a piece. He was the spirit, the embodiment of the band. The one who, in 1957, met a boy named Paul McCartney and decided to let him join his band. Without John, there are no Beatles. So when rumblings began that not only were there to be hours of old, unearthed Beatles recordings included with Anthology, but brand new music, many fans were skeptical.
Plus, 2 new Beatles songs, the Beatles Anthology.
Okay, sure, we have 3 of the Beatles here with us, each incredibly talented and capable. But really, what does it all mean without John? Can you even call it a Beatles track? The music begins to play. It sounds different, yet familiar. Ringo's strong, emphatic drumming. George's simple, but striking guitar line. Paul's bass underneath it all. But no John. The intro builds. We feel the verse approaching. Then comes filling our ears the voice, not of Paul, not of George, not even Ringo, but John. And just like that, in some small way, John was with us again. This is the story of a songwriter, of his former bandmates, of an attempt to somehow, some way, bring the band back to life. With the recent announcement of the re-release and remaster of the Beatles Anthology, as well as a remaster of Free as a Bird, I thought it only right to spend a little time on this portion of the post-Beatles history and to talk about the song, Free as a Bird, itself. This is how to conjure a Beatles song from thin air. The Beatles Anthology was a long time coming. Neil Aspinall, who since the very beginning served as the Beatles' roadie before rising in the ranks to become the manager of Apple Corps, and technically, the Beatles themselves before, well, you know. It was he and Dennis O'Dell of Apple Films who first began discussing the project. These talks began all the way back in 1968, when the Apple Corps film branch began collecting archive footage, compiling as much as they could, with the end goal of eventually creating the de facto Beatles documentary. But clearly, things got complicated quickly. The Beatles were falling apart. Behind closed doors, both interpersonal and business disputes were driving huge, spiky wedges between the band members. But more accurately, between Paul and the other 3 Beatles. When Paul announced to the public in April of 1970 that he was quitting the Beatles, it was viewed as the end of an era. The Beatles, as the world had known them, were gone. But there was still hope, still possibility on the horizon. The Beatles, like it or not, were tied to each other through their contracts, through Apple Corps. In some way or another, they were still together. The Beatles brand, their organization, was alive. Work continued on the documentary. Then Paul McCartney sued the Beatles. He filed a lawsuit against the other three Beatles in London's High Court of Justice for the dissolution of the band's contractual partnership. There was no dancing around this matter. The documentary project was shelved. The judge would rule in Paul's favor, and Paul found himself vindicated soon after when the other three Beatles began suing the man who arguably created this whole mess, Alan Klein. They reached a settlement with Klein, and by the end of 1974, the four former Beatles came together once more, not as a band, but as a legal entity. The Beatles, officially, were dissolved. Finally, work could continue on the proposed documentary, at this point called The Long and Winding Road. Around 1976 or 77, Neil Aspinall had created a very rough draft of the documentary, which he began sending around to the Beatles. At this point, it was really just a montage of archival footage and performances. They began contacting directors. Things were coming together. But just as is often the case in the business, the film train grinded to a halt, and when John was murdered in 1980, it came apart completely. For a long time, that was it. It wasn't until the beginning of the 90s that things began percolating again. But here's the thing. Paul, George, and Ringo, despite finally settling the last of their legal disputes, were not exactly on super friendly terms. Sure, they made a lifetime's worth of memories together in their time as the Beatles, but in the meantime, they've spent nearly 20 years in legal battle with each other. Any sort of reunion would carry plenty of baggage with it. And as far as overcoming this baggage goes, I'd like to share a wonderful quote from George Harrison, sourced, hilariously enough, from a question he answered in a Yahoo chat room in 2001. He was asked, "Does Paul still piss you off? Tell us the truth." And George responded, "Scan not a friend with a microscopic glass. You know his faults, then let his foibles pass. Old Victorian proverb. I'm sure there's enough about me that pisses him off, but I think we have grown old enough to realize that we're both pretty damn cute. Basically, we're both a bit of a pain. Let's let bygones be bygones." So it was in 1992 that production began in earnest on what would become the Beatles Anthology. In early 1994, Yoko joined along, and it was around this time that the team, or the Threedles, as I will call them, got their hands on a series of demo tapes, mostly unreleased music, written by the one and only John Lennon. And now that we're finally caught up, it's time to rewind again. John's struggles began early in his life and never truly went away. When he and Yoko began their relationship in 1968, it was considered a scandal, and with the Beatles' breakup following not long after, they spent the first few years of their time together in tumult. But as we all know, John and Yoko were fully enmeshed. It was them versus the world. So when John and Yoko separated around the middle of 1973, John lost a significant piece of his identity. What followed has been deemed the lost weekend. John and Yoko would be separated for a chaotic 18 months before deciding to start over. Yoko would become pregnant. In late 1968, she suffered a tragic miscarriage. But this time, she gave birth to a healthy boy who came into the world on the very same date as his father. On October 9th, 1975, on John's 35th birthday, Sean Lennon was born. This marked a significant change in John's life and perspective. When his first son Julian was born in 1964, he was in the prime of his career with the Beatles. John kept touring, he kept recording music. Julian, quite frankly, wasn't John's first priority. But with Sean's birth, John decided to step away from the music industry almost entirely. He became a stay-at-home dad, living a simple life. And while he did not release any music for almost 5 years, he never stopped writing it. Music was a part of John. For him, it was like breathing. At some point, it had to come out. He recorded innumerable demos. And while many of these ended up recorded in the studio for his last ever release, Double Fantasy, as well as after his death with Milk and Honey, one of them did not. A haunting, wistful track named Free as a Bird. And it is this song we will focus on for the video. Paul would recall, "I played these songs to the other guys, wanting Ringo to have his hanky ready. I fell in love with Free as a Bird. I thought I would have loved to work with John on that. I like the melody, it's got strong chords, and it really appealed to me. Ringo was very up for it. George was very up for it. I was very up for it." To keep in line with the reunion theme, former Beatles music producer George Martin was allegedly the man initially contacted to produce the song, but he declined. But is this really what happened? When interviewed in 2013 about the track, Martin would say that he expressed discomfort in putting the very much alive Beatles together with the now passed John. But if they had asked him to produce, he might have done so. So it sounds to me, at least, that they decided to pivot upon hearing his initial trepidation. Martin would, however, go on to produce the entirety of the Beatles Anthology albums. In the end, they decided to have Jeff Lynne produce the track. Jeff was a former member of Electric Light Orchestra, and also a friend of George's, having produced his 1987 release, Cloud 9. But there was one reunion at the studio console, as brought in was iconic Beatles engineer Geoff Emerick, who in turn brought along engineer John Jacobs. The team was assembled. In 2023, Now and Then was released, but without the aid of a new technological advancement, that being AI, it never would have been. The recording was blanketed in noise, John's voice submerged under his piano. Now and Then was a part of that original group of John Lennon demos, along with Free as a Bird, Real Love, and Grow Old With Me. And these demos weren't recorded in a home studio. No, they are extremely primitive, the fidelity is low, and the instrumental backing often overwhelms John's voice. They were only able to work with the Now and Then demo by utilizing modern technology to clean up the recording and isolate John's voice. And obviously, they did not have AI in 1994. So to, in essence, record over and rearrange John's original demo of Free as a Bird would be an immense technical challenge. All they had to work with was a cassette tape. John's demo was just that, a demo. So he had made no great attempt to maintain a consistent tempo, which on its own is no problem. It's just a sketch after all, but when you are attempting to record in the studio using that very same sketch, it does become a problem. So the engineers began by taking that tape and cutting it up into lots of little precise pieces, separating each phrase, and then meticulously transferring those bits into a sampler. A sampler, if you're unaware, can take many forms, but it is usually a keyboard or a drum pad. So they would transfer each small piece of the song, assign it a trigger on the sampler, turn on a metronome, and then literally replay the song bit by bit, so that it now maintained a constant tempo. It was an incredibly time-consuming practice, and the end result was far from perfect. But now, they had something to work with. But tempo was far from the only challenge. The piano in the recording doesn't wholly drown out John's vocal, but it is louder in the demo than it would ever be in a professional recording. And the two components were irreversibly linked together. So if John's voice was a bit too quiet at parts, you couldn't just turn it up because the piano would come up too. Not to mention the abundance of room noise and tape hiss. What sort of technological wizardry would they come up with this time? Well, the solution, as it turned out, was anything but technological. They simply had Paul double track over John's voice, doing a bit of his best Lennon impression. This was but just a single aspect of the track. It was now time for the Threedles to come together and do the one thing that brought them together all those years ago: play music. But there was still one hurdle remaining, a psychological one. Grief. Despite everything that had happened all those years since the band broke up, despite the clear resentments, at the end of the day, they all loved John. They all missed him dearly. To come together and play like this, without John, was difficult. It's crazy really, because when you think about a new Beatles record, it is impossible because John is not around. I invented a little scenario. He's gone away on holiday, and he's just rung us up, and he says, "Just finish this track for us, will you? I'm sending the cassette. I trust you." That was the key thing. I trust you. Just do your stuff on it. I told this to the other guys, and Ringo was particularly pleased. And he said, "Ah, that's great." It It was very nice, and it was very irreverent towards John. The scenario allowed us to be not too, the great sacred fallen hero. He would have never gone for that. John would have been the first one to debunk that. A fucking hero? A fallen hero? Fuck off. We're making a record. Not to burst anyone's bubble, but just due to the nature of the song's production, there was no big grand moment where the three Beatles stood side by side, performing the rhythm track, while John's voice leapt from the monitors. No, the whole ordeal was very tricky, and thus required extensive overdubbing, essentially recording one element at a time. While they weren't recording together, they nonetheless were all in the same studio, talking, collaborating. Lynn recalls, although a long time has passed since they last recorded as one unit, they worked terribly well together. Being in the control room, watching and listening to them interact with each other was fascinating. Paul and George would strike up the backing vocals, and all of a sudden it's the Beatles again. They were having fun with each other and reminding each other of the old times. I'd be waiting to record, but I was too busy laughing and smiling at everything they were talking about. Instrumentally, it's a very basic track and very in line with the Beatles' style. John's original piano is still in there, but Paul overdubbed his own piano, carefully practiced to mimic John's, while making a few changes here and there. In the final mix, John's piano is barely audible. The engineers took great care in the mixing of Ringo's drums, to give them a timeless quality, but also to evoke the work that Geoff Emerick had performed all those years ago, especially on Revolver, where he worked alongside the band to create a drum sound that was totally unlike anything else at the time. The song launches off with the sound signature to George's post-Beatles career, the slide guitar, a decision which immediately might have stirred up a little bit of that good old days Beatles tension. Paul recalled, I was worried because it was going to be George on slide. When Geoff suggested slide guitar, I thought, it's my sweet lord again. It's George's trademark. John might have vetoed that. I felt that the song shouldn't be pulled in any way. It should stay very Beatles. It shouldn't get to sound like me solo, or George solo, or Ringo for that matter. It should sound like a Beatles song. So the suggestion was made that George might play a very simple bluesy lick rather than get too melodic. And he did. What he played was almost like a Muddy Waters riff, and that really sealed the project. It wouldn't be a Beatles project without Paul attempting to micromanage George's guitar playing.
I'll play, whatever you want me to play.
Just teasing, Paul. Personally, I fall in the camp that the slide guitar doesn't sound especially Beatles, but they didn't set out to mimic themselves. Had the Beatles stayed together, you'd bet your ass we'd have heard George on some slide guitar sooner or later. There's even a bit in the Get Back documentary with George playing around with a little slide guitar and John joking with him.
I mean, that's the cheapest one, actually. But if he gets any good on it, we'll give him a good one.
The portion of the arrangement that needed the most work was the middle 8, where in the original demo, John just mutters a couple of lines without completing the lyrics. So it was up to Paul and George to finish them off, a task which again brought up a little bit of their past. Paul said, when we were working on Free as a Bird, there were one or two little bits of tension, but it was actually cool for the record. For instance, I had a couple of ideas that he didn't like, and he was right. I'm the first one to accept that, so that was okay.
Whatever happened to the life that we once knew? Can we really live without each other?
Paul contributed a simple, driving bass line, and he claims that he went out of his way not to get too fancy with it. In the context of the song, it's brilliant. The end of this song features a wonderful little homage to George Formby, with George Harrison playing a little ukulele bit. But they went a step even further into Beatles silliness as they dug into the archives and found a recording of John speaking the famous Formby catchphrase.
Turned out nice again, hasn't it?
They reversed John's voice, stuck it at the end of the track, and apparently they all swear up and down that it was not until later that it hit them. In reverse, it sounded distinctly like Made by John Lennon. I remember being a tiny Beatles-obsessed child and watching for the very first time the Beatles Anthology series. And what has lingered in my mind, as much as anything, are those first opening sounds and images. We hear the flutter of a bird's wings, flitting about the inside of a cloudy gray room, stopping to glance at the childhood pictures of our very own Beatles. We would be remiss to tell the story of this song without also including the history of the music video. It is a moody and evocative piece of work, one that, for fervid Beatles fans, is a delight to watch, with every frame packed full of little Easter eggs. Brought in to direct the film was Joe Pytka, who had a wealth of experience in commercials and music videos, having directed a few for Michael Jackson. Oh, and he would go on to direct Space Jam the year after, directing Free as a Bird. From the jump, the team gave themselves a difficult task. First off, there was the point of view of the film itself, of course being a bird. So rather than utilizing static shots, the camera had to be in constant motion. We never see that bird though, because according to Neil Aspinall, no one could agree on what kind of bird it should be. They used steady cams, crane cams, toy helicopter cams. They didn't have drones back then. They went out of their way to use as many real locations as they could, all with the understanding that each shot would later be superimposed over with bits of archival footage and other digital imagery. This is all difficult enough on its own, but the editing and post-production stage proved to be even more difficult, especially with the Beatles occasionally in the team's ears, saying, "Oh, add this, add that." George wanted to be included in the last shot of the music video, where our camera pans behind the back of a faceless ukulele player. Joe Pytka, however, felt that none of the present-day Beatles should appear in the music video. But Joe Pytka would later go on to regret this decision, especially once he learned that the ukulele bit, which he assumed had been sampled, was actually played by George himself. The music video was scheduled to premiere on November 20th. The team turned it in only one day before. Let's play a game called Spot the Beatle Reference, because there are probably close to 100 packed into the music video. Since most of you probably have reasonably functional eyes, I'm only going to point out the slightly obscure examples, or at least the ones where it is not the Beatles themselves appearing. The flutter of the bird's wings greatly resembles that from the introduction of the worldwide wildlife fun version of Across the Universe. I'd say this bouncer reasonably resembles the doorman who worked the cavern during the Beatles' time. Paddy Delaney, probably a bit of a stretch though. Strawberry Fields, we see a man with eggs. Eggman, anybody? We have our pretty, well, nurse selling poppies from a tray. Another Penny Lane reference with our barber and every head he's had the pleasure to know. Sign on the wall reads, "Help, a boy appears to tell a girl a secret. Do you want to know it?" A birthday cake that has a 6 and a 4 on it. We see George walk into an office with a sign reading, "Dr. Robert." We know what he's getting there, wink wink. They recreate the car crash behind A Day in the Life, a real incident in which socialite and friend to Paul McCartney, Tara Brown, died. And they recreate it to an almost disturbing degree of accuracy. And there's a fire engine. I can't tell if it's especially clean though. Policemen in a row. Helter-skelter slide. Look, a kite. Pig children. Someone entering a house through a window. Oh, a rider. A paperback rider. A bowl of green apples, a box of Savoy truffles, a picture of Chairman Mao, workers repairing a hole in the roof. Blue Meanie pops his head through said hole. A newspaper taxi. The magical mystery tour passes by in the far background. We see a big game hunter leading a procession, including an elderly lady and an elephant. We also see a sitarist resembling Ravi Shankar, George's mentor. We see the head of Stu Sutcliffe pasted on the body of James Dean. Then we head to Eleanor Rigby with the headstone and the priest. Right after, Paul's sheepdog Martha runs on through. There's an especially long and winding road in the background here. And who couldn't recognize that crosswalk? Honestly, the care and attention to detail in this music video is remarkable. Not to mention the overall atmosphere. We as Beatles fans could not be more spoiled with the continued preservation of their history, and we are treated once again with the re-release and remaster of not only the Anthology series, but the Anthology albums as well. This has been a quick intermission to celebrate the good news. I would like to thank you all so much for watching, and if you'd like to see more videos like this, or watch all of the Beatles documentaries I already have, please consider subscribing so you can stay tuned in. I also have a Patreon. You will get videos there weeks early, and it only costs $1 to do so. It's a way to help support me, and it's an enormous help. But with that, again, thank you for watching. Until next time.